This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, and now you can rate the podcast on Spotify. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. If you are looking for some post-deconstruction, post-deconversion community, we have a private Facebook group called Deconversion Anonymous, found at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. We are trying to build a thriving community, and we'd love to have you. Special thanks to Mike T. for editing today's podcast. On to today's show. My guest today is Will. Will has a very popular Instagram account called Heretical Theology. Will was a very dedicated Christian. He was looking for the truest form of Christianity. He and his wife moved at one point just to be at a church where he thought God was calling them to be. But he began to have doubts right at the moment when he was beginning to consider ministry training. And those doubts kept going. And the answers that he was getting were pat answers that were unsatisfying. At the same time, Will was writing Facebook posts about the Bible. Sharp-eyed readers would have noticed that he was beginning to have a change of mind. Eventually, after deconversion and realizing he no longer believed in God, he didn't know what to do with all of the Bible knowledge that he had. So he had the idea of creating Heretical Theology on Instagram, with the idea of teaching atheists about the Bible. And he jokes that this did not go over well. The memes that he creates are memes that have little-known statements of fact about the Bible, about the history of Christianity, as well as posing questions that are thought-provoking in order to cause believers to at least understand their faith, if not doubt it. Will's Instagram timeline is well worth your time. It is full of information and historical facts, as well as pointing out some of the oddities within the Bible, but he does it in a respectful way. That Instagram account is instagram.com/heretical_theology, and there will be links in the show notes. Here is Will to tell his story. Will, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Hey, good morning.
Hey, so you are Heretical Theology. You have a massive presence on Instagram of basically memes. I think maybe to just start off, if you want to tell us what Heretical Theology is about, and then we're going to jump into your story.
Yeah, so Heretical Theology is about, try to be as honest as possible. I try to critique Christian theology. I propose questions, and I just kind of like put an emphasis on the kinks within the Christian theology.
Yeah,
and just kind of like, hey, this is an issue. I'm aware there might be rationalizations and ways around these issues, but these are issues that I found and I find compelling. And I also like to share things that are typically not shared in church. For one reason or another, and they probably should be. And so that's kind of like my thing is I'm trying to give a different perspective on theology that the church is either unwilling or incapable of sharing, on their own behalf. And I think Christians should know this information.
Okay. All right. Very cool. So let's jump in then to your story of where did you come from and where are you now? What was your faith tradition growing up?
Yeah, so there's different stages. There was one stage where I was raised Methodist as a young kid, very rural church in rural Ohio. And so, I was raised Methodist there, then ran into another church that was actually having their church services in our school, conveniently enough. So that's a problem there.
Yeah.
And I guess they're renting out one of the lecture halls or something like that. But that's how I found them and started going to their youth group. Turned out they were a cult.
Ooh.
Or ended up becoming a cult. I don't think they could be considered a cult in the very beginning.
Okay.
But clearly they had some very extreme perspectives that would not be considered the most, how would you say it? They would not be considered the most appealing
Orthodox,
to, yeah.
yeah.
Very, very militant, very strict. And
Okay.
I kind of gravitated to that because like, well, I want to know the truth. I want to know the whole truth. And so being this young, angsty teenage kid, like that was all that I wanted.
Yeah.
Fast forward about 15 years, my wife and I, super long story short, ended up moving to Florida because we believe God had called us to a new church down here in Florida. And that was a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we literally quit our jobs and moved 1,000 miles away to start attending this church, not for a job or anything. In fact, we didn't have jobs when we moved down.
Oh, interesting. Oh, so it wasn't
We
like
had a place to live.
it wasn't like ministry or something. You wanted to go to a particular church.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so that was kind of fascinating. And so that was a mega church. That was they had about 10,000 people.
Okay.
And it was just very refreshing.
Do you mind if we explore that just a little bit? Like what was it that
Yeah.
drew you there?
So my brother lived down here, and we live down here now still. And we went down here to visit him, so we visited his church. And my wife was having issues with our cult church as it was, and she was kind of hoping for this. I don't know what she was specifically looking for, but secretly hoping that, hey, we can move down here to Florida to be closer to Disney World and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
she was
Yeah,
not happy in Ohio. And I told her, no, it's not going to happen. We're called to our specific church, and it would literally take an act of God for us to move different churches.
Yeah.
Because we have one already. And so we go to this huge church. My brother's like introduced me to all these people and show me all these big things. And I'm like, okay, yeah, this is great. No wonder people like this church because it has literally everything you want, including a coffee shop. Not even just like a coffee stand, an actual coffee shop.
Right.
And I don't know. So it actually kind of turned me off. But then during the sermon, because I had actually looked at previous sermons and listened to them to see what they would be studying that weekend.
Yeah.
And it was actually kind of interesting hearing the pastor say stuff, and I didn't really hear anything I disagreed with. I'm like, okay, well, he's a very nice pastor, so it makes sense he draws people to him. But that Sunday I was there, it was like Mother's Day weekend, and so they were like off topic that month or that week, and
Okay.
just more of like a catch-all type sermon. And so I already had known like what they were going to be talking about that Sunday. And I had all these questions I would have to have answered in my mind if God were to call us to this church.
Okay.
And so I'm like, well, I can't. They're citing some random Old Testament book, I think. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to get any questions answered in this, but at least I'll hear a good Bible study. But again, that was when we found out that it was like an off Sunday.
Right.
And they had like a Mother's Day special sermon.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even the same pastor. It was one of the other pastors. But either way, like systematically, like one by one, every single question that I had was being answered like directly. And I'm like, this is a little odd.
Yeah. Yeah.
and so like halfway through, I literally start praying to God, and I'm like, God, what are you trying to tell me here? Because this is kind of starting to freak me out a little bit.
Yeah.
And he's like, shut up and listen. I'm like, okay. And so not only did this pastor continue to answer these questions, but answer them in ways that I never really considered before. And I'm like, okay, well, that's unique. That's interesting. And then it kept on going on and on. I'm like, okay, clearly, God, you're trying to tell me something here. And I started having all this fear because my previous church had just went through a very bad church split the previous year. And basically, if you left the church, you were evil. That's kind of what their perspective was. No one leaves that church on good terms,
right.
Ever.
Okay.
And so like that's where all my spiritual family is from. That's where all my friends are from. Like we lived and breathed at that church.
Yeah.
And so I'm like afraid. I literally tell God, I'm like, hey, I'm kind of scared here. Like, what are they gonna think? He's like, what are you more afraid of? What they think or what I think?
Right.
I'm like, I literally threw my hands up in the air in the middle of the sermon during this conversation, and my wife looks at me like, "What?"
Yeah.
So I type in my phone and in the text box saying, "I think God's calling us to this church or to move to Florida or something like that." And so we talked to a pastor afterwards. The first thing to do was ask my wife what she thought. She's like, "I like the idea," and literally, so that was on Mother's Day. I think that's in May. And then by December, actually, is our 1 year anniversary. We moved down here 8 years ago or 7 years ago.
Yeah. So what that tells me, though, I think that what the important part of that story is how seriously you, Will, took your faith, right? Like you were deadly serious about following the will of God. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
but apparently I still wasn't saved to some people.
Okay.
But yes, that is a very charitable statement.
Yes.
I would agree with that.
And then, like, what was the experience when you did get there? Was it did you continue to feel like God was calling you to stay there once you arrived?
Yeah, I mean, and even I was like, I had to think critically. Like even now, I still had the whole like skeptical mindset where I'm like, okay, I still got this whole new thing going on. Like it's still a very shiny, pretty thing. So let's wait for the honeymoon phase to pass.
Yeah.
And it did. One of the pastors had me fill an application for their school of ministry,
Mhm.
which I thought was kind of odd because I've only been there for like a month or two. But the
Right.
school of ministry is like a 2 year like process where they have like their own accreditation to become a pastor and church leader and things like that.
Okay.
I'm like, well, I mean, I'm not going to do it. So I went ahead and applied and I made like to the final interview stage. And basically it came down to the elders like, well, we have all these other people who's been here for years who we want in. And this guy, we have no clue who he is. He's only been here for 3 months. I'm like,
Yeah.
that is a smart decision. Like, I would not have brought me into the school ministry either.
Right.
But the pastor who was like my discipler, like
Yeah.
mentor at the time, he was kind of upset about it, but then he wanted to make sure that next time it was going to be more than obvious.
Yeah.
And so he was having me basically do everything the school ministry people did anyways.
Yeah.
And just train me up as a leader on his own. But it was a good experience. I mean, I'm still friends with quite a few people from that church. Not so much from my cult church. In fact, I don't think I talked to anyone from my cult church anymore. We've had all. I mean, I kind of saw that coming.
Yeah.
Even when we did leave the church, it was so like they didn't shun me. They don't really technically shun people, but that's essentially what they do.
Right.
But it was still very awkward, and there was a lot of tension. And then, like as I became more of a mainstream Christian, I think they considered me as a more lukewarm Christian,
Right.
and they were becoming more skeptical of my posts and things like that.
Yeah, I did want to comment on the rush to leadership. My experience as a teenager, I went to a much smaller church, so not a mega church in any way. But I mean, almost immediately within a month or two, they were like, I was 19 at the time, and so it was like, you don't actually fit in the youth group, but why don't you lead in the youth group? And it's like, all right. And I think that's super common. Like they're so desperate for people to do the work that they can sometimes rush that process. So I think that's a really interesting part of the story.
Yeah, it's they like to straight to iron when it's hot. Is that the correct terminology?
Yes.
They see someone with this passion, like, oh,
Yeah,
let's use that person while they have it.
Exactly. Did you ever mention your previous church to the new church, and did they have a particular reaction to that?
Oh yeah. In fact, there was. I think they actually get a lot of people who do that, who leave these fundamental circles, who are then drawn to this softer. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like, or not pronounce what to say. It's like they have a better way of dissecting the Bible and presenting it in a less offensive manner. Whereas my cult church, like they literally didn't give two shits about. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss on here.
No, that's fine. Yeah. I should have mentioned that. You're fine.
Okay, gracefully. It's okay.
Yeah. Sometimes slightly less so.
Okay, fantastic. Like, but that was. It's funny you mentioned that though, because when and this might be veering off, branching out from what you want to talk about, but like looking back, when I look at what the cult church, Jiggleswell Fellowship, that's the name. They're up in Ohio. When I look at what they taught, and I look at what the big church, the Calvary Chapel Melbourne Church taught, they're essentially the same.
Right.
Like the doctrines are the same, the beliefs are the same. Like, but the only difference is how forthright they are about these things. Right. And in a sense, this is why I have a lot of respect for fundamentalist churches, because at least they're just like upfront and honest with you about, hey, yeah, God's a God of wrath, and He's gonna fire and brimstone you to death to hell if you don't submit and worship Him. Whereas the more mainstream churches are like, well, it's not quite like that, but it's like that.
Yeah, I think, Will, that you and I have that in common. So I talk about on the podcast a lot having an honesty contest. And I feel like a lot of times, even our discussions between secular people and believers, it turns out to be debate or rational argument or what have you. And I say, you know what, let's just have an honesty contest. And I totally agree with you that there is something refreshingly honest about hardcore fundamentalist churches, and that they are really just saying what the Bible actually says.
Precisely.
So continuing on at the new church, did you eventually get into their ministry program, and how did that go?
So we were there for 5 years, and the second round, well, the next round of school of ministry was quickly approaching, but my wife was starting to have serious doubts about her faith.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so she it's just something about wives and women just always being ahead of the curve of their husbands. I don't know.
They are very smart. Yes.
But and it was causing, a lot of conflict, a lot of turmoil within me. And I was trying to listen to her, trying to be, the gracious, loving husband that I needed to be. This is completely uncharted territory for me. We have excellent communication, her and I, and she was just being completely honest with me, and I don't really know how to navigate that at the time. So I kind of had concluded that, well, I guess I'm just going to be that Christian leader who has an unbelieving spouse, and that's that. Yeah. And I'm just going to keep on loving her like I'm supposed to. Well, it wasn't to try to reconvert her, but in a sense to understand her. I was also trying to understand the Bible better, and because I had a lot of, I'm becoming more, I don't want to use liberal, but less conservative, at least with my theology,
right?
And moving from very rural Ohio, even though I lived in the city, it was still Ohio. Moving out here to Central Florida, where it's just very diverse, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and
trying to have a better perspective of how other people understand the Bible, so I could relate the Bible to them better. And so I essentially, what I would call now my Jesus goggles, I would turn my Jesus goggles off, and I would read the Bible as if I had never heard of the story before in my life.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, so let's just pretend that I'm some person from some other country, don't know anything about Christianity, don't know anything about this stuff, and I want to learn this all over again. And that's what I started doing with my Bible posts, because I was doing like this thing on Facebook where I would read the Bible every day, and I would share my story and what I would learn. And that was about the time the school of ministry was starting to happen again.
Okay.
And I had a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And I was having a lot of issues.
Yeah.
And to a point where, because this is also when Trump was the nominee for president.
Okay.
Yeah. And that happened.
In Florida. Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's like a whole other underlying issue as well. Because, plot twist, like, I was a follower of Christ. I was not a follower of Trump.
Right.
And I can't believe how naive I was about this. But when Trump was nominated as the candidate, I'm like, well, I guess the church is going to be sitting this one out because the church no longer has a candidate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Good Lord, I had never been so wrong about something before in my life. And I could not believe what was happening. Like, what is going on? Like, not just within my church here in Florida, but like around. Oh, and my cult church in Ohio.
Yeah,
they were. Oh, I'm like, I'm in the twilight zone. What is happening? And I was able to, like, well, no church is perfect, like they say, and like, so I being the younger millennial, I was pissing off a lot of the Generation Y, or well, not Generation Y, but the boomers and them with my more liberal theology. because I didn't support Trump.
Let's pause for just a second and say I felt the same way as a non-believer, in that I was watching my some of my Christian family members who I knew them really well. Like, I knew that they loved people. I knew they were conservative, but I was shocked at how fast that took place, right? That Trump took over. And
Right.
one other angle on this is that my wife is still a believer, and I was watching her grieve that process. So the same shock that you felt, I think my wife felt, that didn't change her faith in any way, but the grief of watching people she cared about embrace what was kind of
Mhm.
antithetical to the faith itself. So it really was, when you look back on it, it really was shocking. Like, it's hard to overstate how
Right.
intense that was.
And I don't want to be disingenuous. Like, I understand conservative people voting for Trump. Okay, I'm not that's not quite my issue. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
people are going to toe the line, and who I as much as it frustrates me, I get it.
yeah,
What I don't get was the infatuation and the foaming of the mouth over Trump. Like, it's one thing to hold your nose and vote for somebody. And I guess another thing, like, we must make sure he gets in power, or else the whole world will end and the church will be persecuted. All this other nonsense. Like no, that is not at all the same thing. And
yeah.
this is terrifying. Like, it was. I don't. It was very interesting when you juxtapose it to how they treated the church, treated President Obama.
Hmm.
Like, and my cultures, like, they literally thought he was like the Antichrist. Okay,
Yeah,
maybe not quite literally, but they would call him the abomination of desolation.
yeah.
Okay, like, it was very disturbing. But yet, when the church was so anti President Obama, but at the exact same time we're so pro Trump, I'm like, the hypocrisy here cannot be overstated.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, it is just so painfully apparent, and I knew that as a Christian. And I'm like, this is going to cause some issues with me, for sure.
So yeah, you, like, I think many, particularly millennials, like that age group, I think really got hit hard by the 2016 election. I think we all did, but
Hmm.
there's this wave now of evangelicals, of people around your age, where that was just the last straw. So that was one element. You were having some questions. You were digging into the Bible, and you were contemplating doing the ministry training. Let's continue with that.
Yeah, so I just didn't even submit an application
Okay.
because I knew that I was becoming more and more unstable, like, as every single day went by. Um, and I just didn't do it. Because it's a 2-year commitment, and I'm like projecting myself. I can't even see where my faith is going to be a month from now.
Right. Right.
Let
Yeah.
alone, like, and during that process, we actually stopped going to the main church services, and we just started going to this young adults group. Even though we're kind of out of this age, we still have a lot of friends in that community, and the pastor. It was still within the main church, but it was just like one
Right.
small group within that church, and he was very genuine, and actually seemed to care about me and gave honest answers, including I don't know, which was refreshing. It still won't work out in the end, but it was great to have that small community. And actually, one of my best friends actually evolved from that community as well, which was pretty great.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So yeah, in fact, the pastor who had been mentoring me, he wanted to meet up with me to talk about ministry, and because we have these meetups like every 2 weeks, and I'm just like unloading on him with all my issues. I'm like, I'm having this problem, this problem. I have this question, and just like opening my heart out to him. And he's like, "Well, okay. Well, I thought we were gonna be talking about ministry today, but I guess we can talk about that next week." I'm like, "Really, dude?
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?" I don't think he meant for it to come out like that, just knowing the type of person he is. But just that one conversation, like, this is so much bureaucratic crap, and I'm so done with it.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I always like to distinguish between kind of the process of deconstructing church a little bit, or deconstructing
Mhm.
the Bible, and then your actual relationship with God, or your faith in God. So where were you on that kind of spectrum at that point in time?
So we had already stopped going to the church services,
Yeah.
and we were still going to the YA group. But honestly, there was only about a month or two when we had officially stopped going to church,
Okay.
and then when I'm just like, God and I were done.
I see.
There was probably about, I say this was about 2 or 3 months ago. I would consider myself a non-religious progressive Christian.
Okay.
So because things just kind of like fell out in droves. Like I stopped believing the Old Testament entirely, and then I stopped believing in hell.
Yeah.
And then it was just to a point where I'm like, well, I think Jesus may have been some sort of amazing person who may or may not have had some sort of connection to God. Basically relying on C.S. Lewis's "A Lord, Liar, Lunatic."
Mm-hmm.
That was like my last straw, and
Okay.
I was completely relying on that logic, that hedging my bets that Jesus was who he said he was, and that fell through too. So
Yeah. Okay.
and then I literally had a prayer when I told God, I don't think I can believe it anymore.
Oof. I feel you, my friend.
Yeah.
What was it like then telling your wife? Like you said, she was ahead of the curve. Was she really receptive of that, or was she nervous about that?
I think she saw it coming. Again, her and I communication throughout this whole process was pretty clear. And
Yeah.
I was making these Facebook posts. This is what's so fascinating, because I was making these Facebook posts starting on January 1st, and then by October 9th, I had lost my faith.
Right. Okay.
And then I came out. I don't want to use that term. I was honest about my posts a month later, saying I was no longer a Christian.
Okay.
On Facebook, and that was when D-Day happened, essentially, for my social life. So she knew what was happening, and it's kind of fascinating to look at my memories, throughout the year, to see the gradual process. I had to have a literal journal of what was going through my mind.
I think that's super valuable, actually.
A lot of people is asking me to write a book. I don't think I'm going to write a book, but I do think there might be something there to just literally copy and paste those posts and fix the massive typos, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
like insert some nuance as well with what I think was happening going on that day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's so much stuff happening in the background. Like when I got introduced to Bart Ehrman, for example, was a big one, and Sam Harris.
Okay.
And then starting listening to counter apologetics from atheists.
Yeah.
But yeah, my wife was pretty aware. In fact, we were watching one of Ehrman's Great Courses, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And I was trying to let her see what she thought about this stuff, because it wasn't very helpful for me, and that's
Yeah.
pretty much what she says. And she's like,
Right.
"Well, this sure as hell isn't helping you."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it was good, but her and I were fortunate enough to both deconstruct at this roughly the same time. There's about 6 months buffer there. But yeah.
Okay. That's fantastic. And it sounds like there just weren't any surprises. You kind of could watch each other go through that process
Yeah.
a bit. So you hinted at a D-Day. So what was some of the fallout after you announced that you no longer believed?
Right. So I'm still making these Bible posts. I think people who are actually reading them saw the writing on the wall. I knew this was coming. But here I am, people still thinking I'm a Christian. I'm making these Bible posts, and I'm like, well, I can't in good faith keep on making these posts without telling people the context of where I'm coming from now.
Right.
And so I just made your typical 3 to 5 paragraph Facebook status about why I'm not a Christian anymore, and that I understand some people can no longer associate with me now, and I hope that's not the case. But I understand why, because I did the exact same stuff to other people when I was in a college church, and that's precisely what happens. I think over the course of the next 3 months, I went from like 1,100 of Facebook friends to just under 600.
Wow.
Yeah. So some were me removing people.
Okay.
I definitely did do some of that, because they were just incessant evangelizing going on, where I just told them, like, listen, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
And that was the only way to get them to shut up. But by and large, it was mostly them saying thanks, but no thanks.
Fascinating that, in the age of social media, you literally have a account of that response. That's interesting, because I think in my experience, I definitely found out who my real friends were. That nothing really changed dramatically there, but lots of people just kind of quietly no longer talk to you.
Right. and I get it too. Like I was pretty angsty. Like I'm still pretty dang angsty when it comes to a lot of things. And people use Facebook for different things, and sometimes people just want to hear happy things.
Yeah.
I can get that. I mean, I guess I could call it an echo chamber if they want to, but people have different uses for different tools, and they don't want to hear someone bashing what they believe in all the time. And so if people want to peace out on that, then I guess I can't really blame them.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, like there's still multiple things you can do before you go to completely unfriend somebody to,
Yes.
to deter that,
Yeah.
including talking to the person.
Yes, that would help maybe. So I'd like to turn then to heretical theology on Instagram, and I'll just say like my experience of it, as I'm obviously already a non-believer, but I think you do a really, really good job of getting to the point. You're making a strong point, but at the same time, you're not attacking people. You're not trying to just put them in the defensive immediately, right? Like
I try not to.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm saying the general the general attempt here. I think
you're living up to your name.
But I mean, part of this though, like, is the proof is in the pudding. I mean, you've got a pretty large following. So talk to me about what the idea was, how you came up with it, how that started, and let's talk more about it.
So when I was making my Bible posts, I would originally make them on my personal Instagram feed because I was like all about like athleticism and stuff like that, and the Bible, which is a really common combination, oddly enough, on Instagram.
Interesting.
But when I became non-religious and I was starting to critique the Bible, and people just didn't want to hear it, I'm like, well, I'll just make my own separate Instagram account just where I can share these thoughts.
Yeah.
And I'm like, at this point, I had fully embraced atheism. Like, I'm an atheist now. That's simple as that.
Yeah.
And my original idea was to teach the Bible to atheists about what this, and it went over about as well as you think it would.
Yeah.
So, and I never even heard of the term deconstruction yet. Like I knew of like Joshua Harris. Like I read that book like every other Christian guy did, and so I knew about him. And I think I had followed him. I saw a random post, and then he used the term deconstruction. I'm like, wait, what? What is this? And then I'm like, oh, here's a community of people. Fantastic. I found my people, and then it just kind of grew from there. So that's how heretical theology got started.
Okay. And then the other comment that I have is kind of the idea of limiting yourself for artistic expression. It's very simple. It's just memes, just usually a question, but some kind of statement or question, a text on a background. And I think there's something really beautiful about that, and that limitation, that simplicity is really very cool. Was that intentional?
Yeah, and it keeps me in a box, literally.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't think it's a coincidence that my more unpopular posts are the ones that have like super teeny tiny letters.
Yeah.
So it's as much wording as possible. So, in fact, of course, my more popular posts are basically my 2 or 3 liners on one slide that is just bashing Christianity.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll spend 5 minutes on that, and it'll get over 1,000 likes and 100 shares and follows. Then I'll make like a 10 slide post about all these various nuances about Greek and Hebrew that no one actually cares about, and it'll get like a third of that.
Yeah.
But everyone says, "Oh, that's the ones we like."
Yeah.
I don't know about that. But it's fun. I actually went to school for graphic design, and I like typography.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, so that's why I like playing with the type and the text a lot.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I think my experience, so I kind of went through deconversion on my own, read a bunch of books, and then ventured out onto the internet, and Twitter was where I started. And I immediately noticed that, you can throw some red meat out there and you get attention just, immediately. You get the retweets and the likes and stuff. You say something about humanism, hey, shouldn't we like actually care about each other? And it's just dead silence and nobody cares. And so that's actually part of the impetus of what I'm trying to do with the podcast was I'm like, there's got to be an audience for this somewhere. I'm that audience, and so trying to do that.
No, and that's good, and that's absolutely necessary too, because like I'm starting to catch on. Like we are addicted to outrage as a society, and especially within the ex-evangelical movement for sure. Well, I don't call it movement, the community, nevertheless.
Yeah.
And it's just like, what can we be upset? What are we supposed to be upset about today? And I'm starting to catch on to that. I'm trying to be cognizant of it. Sometimes when I make a post, it's just me venting. Sometimes when I make a post, it's like, hey, this is a legitimate issue that we need to handle. And sometimes it's a post like, hey, there is absolutely zero reason why evangelicals should be doing this, and it is straight up harmful.
Right.
And there needs to be a lot of nuance with those discussions.
Yes. So one of the things that's been kind of a guiding principle for me that I think I'm starting to hear other people articulate now as well is that atheism on its own is just against something, or in the example of just being outraged at things, right? And that will hold a group together in a kind of a quick and fast way, but not over the long term. And trying to figure out what is it that we are actually for, I think is helpful in trying to build a community and move forward, that kind of thing. So I don't know if that's your experience as well.
Yeah, for sure. No, I completely agree. This is why, I mean, I label myself as an atheist, agnostic atheist, but
As do I. Yeah.
I mean, that's just simply a definition of what I believe spiritually or lack thereof.
Right.
And, but like what I truly believe, what my identity is, lies in a secular humanism.
Okay.
Like that's what I actually care about. This is why I care about equality. And I'm an atheist. I use it as that ideology as a tool to curve the harmfulness of religious fundamentalism and evangelicalism.
Right. And to be clear, I think that is still necessary, right? I think calling out the egregious abuses of the evangelical church is still necessary. So yeah. You had a recent post that talked about, it was very honest about how things are not all perfect and rosy on this side of lack of faith. What were you trying to get across with that? And maybe just talk about the honesty that was in that post.
Man, I have to look at the post. Shoot.
I think you said specifically that, you lost community, that, that if happiness is part of being connected to people, that you'd lost some of that. And so it isn't all perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't become an atheist because to earn cool points.
Right.
I think it was a pastor from the Gospel Coalition that said something like that. Like it's trendy or something like that
so absurd
to be an ex-Christian. I'm like, no, that's absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
Like there is just going to record now. There is absolutely nothing happy about losing, literally half of your friends.
Yeah.
At least on social media. Not that means a whole lot, but it does in this day and age, unfortunately. But it tells a lot when people who you've prayed with and worshipped with and served with and went on mission trip with, that as soon as you say, hey, I'm struggling, hey, I don't have an answer for this, help me, hey, I'm an atheist now, and they just piece out of your life, like that to me shows the hollowness of evangelicalism.
Yeah. And it's victim blaming as well. It's like, it's your fault that you're having doubts in some ways.
But there's definitely not a lot of happiness into it. In fact, I mean, I am less happy as an atheist. I think that's now I remember the post that you're referring to. It's like, if I can be completely honest about it, I was happier as a Christian. I had more people then to talk to. It was nice being able to close my eyes and pray about a situation and then just mentally give that to God and then not have it stress me out. I meditate now, which I don't do nearly as often as I'm supposed to, but like I'm dealing with hardcore anxiety now. I'm dealing with more health issues now, and I think a lot of it has to do with stress and not having that community of people. And I can probably blame COVID a lot for that. We actually had a really great outing with some humanist people that we met on Meetup a couple weeks ago. It was a great time. We loved it.
Yeah,
like I missed that. That was awesome. But there's still emotionally nothing like the emotion and the endorphins that you get going to a church service.
I have currently a family member who is very ill, and definitely I miss the ability of just, being able to just pray and believe that something out there is going to make things better, or potentially will, right? Even just that potential element. It is the stark reality of, reality. It can sometimes be quite difficult to manage.
No, it definitely is, and I think it gives us more mental fortitude handling these things.
Yeah,
but that becomes exhausting at times. And just because something makes you happier doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to handle
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I definitely, on the flip side of the coin, the mental rest of not having to defend or explain to myself these, contradictory ideas, that way overcompensates for having to face reality. So,
That's a good point.
yeah. So as we wrap up, a question I like to ask people are: what are your influences? Like what books or podcasts or YouTube influences have helped you along this road?
So Sam Harris has actually probably been, at least up until a few months ago, was probably the number one influencer, just because if it wasn't for Joe Rogan having Sam Harris on his podcast,
Mm-hmm.
I would not have heard about Bart Ehrman. So Bart Ehrman was another one.
Okay.
And as far as like more low key YouTubers, like Paulogia was a big one. Actually, so I found him to be very unique and very well read. In fact, a lot of the stuff that I learned exiting Christianity came from him specifically. So I liked a lot of his insights. But as far as like the more mainstream people, like definitely Sam Harris. I actually have his meditation app, which is super helpful. Definitely gives me a little more Zen, which I need a lot more Zen.
Okay, cool.
And but actually, as of late, Yuval Noah Harari,
Yes.
that man is just freaking brilliant. Um, I read Homo Deus, and then I read Sapiens last year,
Mm-hmm.
and it was kind of like what I was looking for sound, reasonable secularism.
Yeah.
Like it's difficult to find a good secular book with secular values that isn't at the exact same time trying to go against religion.
Right.
Like his books are like just post Christian, like post religion.
Exactly.
It's like he mentions it in passing, and he's like, okay, yeah, well, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's all nonsense, and then he just moves on with it, and it's just so brilliant the way he puts things together. And then I recently just finished 21 lessons for for the 21st century, and that essentially takes his knowledge of his previous few books and then puts them into application. And it was arguably, I mean, it was the best book I read this year, probably the best book I've read ever.
Okay.
And it was just fantastic. So if your listeners haven't listened to him yet, I highly recommend it. And he's able to do all these things completely devoid of religion. Now he'll say he has spirituality, and he'll tell you spirituality is necessary, but like how Sam Harris talked about spirituality, it's not the same thing when religious people are talking about spirituality.
Yeah.
It's I'm still not even 100% sure what he means, to be honest with you. Like I'm still angsty enough where I hear the word, I still have like a little twitch where I'm like, I don't like that word, but I'm trying to chill the f out and just like listen and take a breath and be like, okay, this makes sense. Like it's basically a higher level of emotional, mental aspects things. I don't know what heck I'm talking about, but it's like elevated consciousness. That's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Spirituality.
I do the same, like struggling with the language. Anytime I say the word spirituality, what I mean is, the wholeness of being a human being, and but it's very difficult to be clear about that when you use those terms sometimes.
Right.
One other point, if I could take just another moment of your time that I think is really important, is that idea of post-religious or post-Christian. I do think that's important. I feel like sometimes our focus, talking with apologists is a waste of time for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, I think it's just a dead theory. Theism is a dead theory, right? Like there's nothing more that I can say about it that hasn't already been said better than I can. And let's just move on. What do we do next is what I'm most interested in.
No, I completely agree. And that's been a pretty honest critique that a lot of ex-evangelicals have towards me. I'm like, they're like, are you going to move on? I'm like, I would like to. And I am, but that's not the point of heretical theology.
Sure. Yeah.
I have literally decades of useless Bible knowledge that I mean, even when I was a Christian, was pretty high level compared to most pastors, even though I was never a pastor.
Yeah.
Now that I know all the secular information from a secular perspective and the history of the Bible, it's like there's no way not to be arrogant. It's like I know some shit about the Bible, and I would like to put that to some good use, and that's why I have that page, so that people can take that information, break it down however they want to, and then hopefully they do become tired of my page and they outgrow me and become the next, Yuval Noah Harari. Like that would make me ecstatic. But I'm there for the people who's in between that process, who's having that crisis of faith, who's tired of the church being lied to them, who needs that other perspective, and so they can make their own actual decision with all the variables.
Excellent. I could not have wrapped it up better. Do you want to tell them the URL specifically in Instagram?
It's just heretical _theology. That's where I'm at. I'm usually the person who's making all these really long-winded black and white posts and never read the comments because I'll lose my crap way too easily.
Will, thank you so much for telling your story on the Graceful Atheist podcast.
Hey, this was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Final thoughts on the episode. Well, as you can hear, Will has a really interesting perspective on the Bible, having studied so much and having been a teacher of the Bible within Christianity, and then on the other side of deconstruction and deconversion, still wanting to do something with that knowledge and creating heretical theology. For the two of you who are listeners of mine who have never seen Will's work on Instagram, please check it out at instagram.com/heretical_theology. Amazing questions, historical facts, perspective on the history of Christianity that is thought-provoking, at the same time being respectful. As we discussed in the conversation, I think the limitation of the meme text on a background provides an artistic element to what Will is doing, and I really respect that work. Links in the show notes also for the post that we discussed about Will asking himself, am I happier post-deconstruction, post-deconversion? And his honest answer is no. I think what's important about that is recognizing that we have in fact lost something. We've lost friendships. We've lost community. We have lost a sense of control, of someone to call to in our hour of need. As I also mentioned, I think that is outweighed by the mental freedom, letting go of the need to protect and defend our faith. But it is important for us to not sugarcoat things, not to pretend that we have not lost something. And I really appreciated that in that particular post. I want to thank Will for being on the podcast, for sharing his story, for sharing his knowledge and wisdom about the Bible, and doing so with the public on an ongoing basis. I think that is absolutely amazing. Thank you, Will, for being on the podcast. The secular grace thought of the week is one that I keep coming back to over and over again. I've talked briefly about this in the past, but this idea of being for something and not just against something. And Will made a statement in this conversation that I've been thinking about ever since he and I chatted. He was talking about the evangelical movement and the fact that it can at times feed on outrage. And what I found interesting about that is the great critique, and I include myself in critiquing, of new atheism or early 2000s atheism was its anger, was its outrage, and being so anti-religious that it wasn't for anything, it was just against religion. And so what got me thinking about this is that there is an element within the evangelical movement of being outrage driven. And I'm not here to tear down that movement. I think many of us would identify as being a part of that movement. Where I want to go with this is the need to be for something. And in my mind, that something is secular grace. It is loving people, and that loving people needs to be greater than our outrage. It is not that there are not great injustices in the world to be outraged about. It's that outrage isn't necessarily the cure for that injustice. And I think love is. And love motivates us to action, to do, to be just, to even to call out injustice in a way that can be heard by the perpetrators. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. In 2015, I went through my deconversion, and about 5 minutes after that, I started thinking about the concept of secular grace. I knew I wanted to take everything I loved about grace that was found in Christianity, and I recognized that there was nothing supernatural needed there, and I began using the term secular grace very, very quickly. I posted about secular grace in 2016. In 2017, a book was published, Secular Grace, by an Israeli professor named Dr. Dana Freibach-Heifetz, and I apologize if I haven't pronounced her name correctly. I believe it was originally written in Hebrew, and it is translated into English, and I have finally gotten my hands on a copy of this, and it is absolutely amazing. It is eerie to read someone else put down in words, and much more educated words, I should say, than I can, but the ideas that I've been trying to express for so very long. I highly recommend that book. I intend to do a book review on it. I intend to reach out to Dr. Dana and see if we can have her on. But for this particular conversation, this is what is important. She draws a distinct line from the Enlightenment to the existentialist philosophers. The existentialists were grappling with this idea that God is dead. More than that, that the idea of some objective perspective is gone. And the question that existentialists were wrestling with was, what now? And she points out that after the tyranny of religion or a dominant ideology becomes freedom, but there's also terror in that freedom. Freedom is scary. And that is really what the message of the existentialist philosophers was about, is how we face the void of terror and come out the other side. And Dr. Dana's answer and my answer are the same. Secular grace. It is recognizing that the most important thing in our lives is each other. The human connection, one person to one person being a member of a group, and groups being able to recognize the humanity in one another even when we disagree with each other. I just want to be as explicit as I possibly can. I feel the same outrage that the new atheists feel. I feel the same outrage that the evangelicals feel. But I am convinced that the solution is not more outrage. I am convinced that the solution is loving people. And we cannot change the minds of the people with whom we disagree with just anger. I think that grace and love can change minds. I'm well aware that this episode is going out on Martin Luther King's birthday. I feel like, though I'm a white person, I grew up in the shadow of Dr. Martin Luther King, and that kind of grace, a call for justice, a call for action, the willingness to put one's literal life on the line. And although Dr. King was obviously a believer, this is secular grace. And that is the ideal that I will always be trying to live up to. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.